In 1687, John Dryden wrote an ode in honor of Saint Cecilia, the patron saint of music and by tradition the inventor of the organ. Later his ode was set to music by Handel, and you might know that version of it better than you know Dryden's poem. But in it, Dryden describes creation using the metaphor of music. Here's the way the poem starts. From harmony, from heavenly harmony, this universal frame began, when nature underneath a heap of jarring atoms lay and could not heave her head, the tuneful voice was heard from high, arise, ye more than dead. Then cold and hot and moist and dry, in order to their stations leap, and music's power obey. From harmony, from heavenly harmony, this universal frame began. From harmony to harmony, through all the compass of the notes it ran, the diapason closing full in man. That's the way he describes the creation as it might look in a musical sort of way. After several verses in which he praises the power of music, he foresees the end of the world, and he sees that it too will be achieved by music. Here's the way the poem ends. As from the power of sacred lays the spheres began to move, and sung the great Creator's praise to all the blessed above, so, when the last and dreadful hour this crumbling pageant shall devour, the trumpet shall be heard on high, the dead shall live, the living die, and music shall untune the sky. Now, of course, Dryden's poem is not a myth per se, or not a myth in the way that we've been using the term in this course, but he provides a very useful metaphor for thinking of the kind of myths we're going to be talking about in this lecture. That is, myths of the end, myths of cosmic destruction. We have seen in the last lectures that flood myths are related to creation myths in that the differentiation that defines creation is allowed temporarily to collapse back into primeval chaos, out of which some new kind of creation emerges. The same thing is true on a larger scale of myths of cosmic destruction. Here the process of creation is reversed so that all forms and distinctions revert back to a kind of pre-creation unity and chaos. Dryden's poem captures this really nicely. The music, he says, that once tuned the skies will eventually untune them, and then all will be as it was before autumn stirred the waters, or Rangi was forced out of the embrace with Papa, or the toad brings up a tiny bit of mud from the bottom of the primeval sea, or Tiamat or Pan-Ku were dismembered to create the heavens and the earth. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at two destruction myths, one from the east and one from the west, to bring this unit sort of full circle. Specifically, we'll be looking at a Hindu myth from Indian Hindu mythology, and then a Norse vision of Ragnarok, and then perhaps a few generalizations about this great cycle that we will have been across in the last lectures. But first, a word or two about cosmic destruction myths generally. As we've seen, the common denominator of creation myths is differentiation, is division into light and dark, day and night, water and land, yin and yang, male and female. Undifferentiated unity is defined, is divided, is split up into parts. Many of the early deities are androgynous, and they begin by generating out of themselves a male and female half, and then the two mate to get the process all started. There's one really, I think, charming version of this in the Indian Upanishads, and this one begins by saying that the first self, the first being, the first whatever it was that got all of this started, was very like a man and a woman closely embracing. He, she split itself in two into a male and female half, and as soon as they were split in half, he immediately began to desire her. They coupled, and after the coupling, they produced the first human being. Here's where human beings come from. But she is overwhelmed with embarrassment. She said, how in the world can I, having been part of him, having been united with him, how can I be his partner? How can he, looking at me and knowing that I was once a part of him, how can he possibly desire me? So she begins a series of disguises, trying to run away from him, to keep away. First, she disguises herself as a cow. He becomes a bull and he mates with her, and that's where cows come from. She becomes a mare, he becomes a stallion. She becomes a female donkey, he becomes a male donkey. She becomes a nanny goat, he becomes a billy goat. A ewe and a ram, a deer and a stag, they go through this over and over and over again. She keeps running, he keeps chasing her. And from all of these unions, the respective animals are created, down to and including, we are told, even the ants. They finally couple as ants to create those little tiny insects. The sequence here is, I'm always reminded of a ballad in Child's Book of Ballads. I think it's number 44. It's a song about a blacksmith who dedicates himself to trying to win the maidenhead of a young girl, and she dedicates herself to preserving it, to keeping it away from him. And during the song is all about things that she changes into in order to get away from him, and things that he changes into in order then to catch her. So when she becomes a hare, he becomes a greyhound. When she becomes a duck, he becomes a drake. And so this story reminds me very much of that. The point is that differentiation here, as in so many creation myths, is the point of creation. It is one of the things that defines what creation is. So is time. Time is another one of the things that marks creation. Marduk, we remember, sets up the sun and the moon and the stars and the zodiac to start being markers of time. Yahweh, on the third day of creation, starts time by creating the heavenly bodies that will mark its passage. It means that in the New Testament book of Revelations, we are told that we will be able to tell that we're getting close to the end, that things are about to come apart, when those timekeepers begin to go awry, when they start behaving oddly, as time itself begins to unravel. In the 6th chapter of that book, the final days, we are told, will be preceded by earthquakes. Then there will be darkening of the sun. Then the moon will turn to blood, and stars will fall from the sky, as we are told, like figs from a fig tree in a mighty wind. The heavens will roll up like a scroll, mountains and islands will be moved from their places, for, we are told, the great day of his wrath has come, and who shall be able to stand? With time, as time marks the beginning, time unraveling will mark the end. With time comes linear progression. And such concepts as youth and maturity and old age and life and death, since every individual and the cosmos itself is now time-bound, is contingent. Every bit of it is a fragment of some larger whole. The myths that we've been across, and many others that we haven't had a time to mention, know this. In Genesis, we remember that the account of the discovery of sexuality was coincident with the discovery of death. And in that Huron earth diver myth that we looked at, the pregnant woman who falls from the sky gives birth to twins, one of whom becomes the god of death, the other becomes the promoter of human life. This is part of the great wisdom of these creation myths, and each culture has its own idea of how the cosmos ends, including us, because we have a theory, a Big Bang theory, that has an account of how it will all end for us as well. One account of the origin of the universe is the Big Bang, which is that there was an explosion of an energy source so dense that it expands outward. And it continues to expand outward and outward and outward. Eventually, as this expansion occurs, it gets diffused and will continue to do so until it reaches the point of entropy or heat death, when all energy will have been used up and it will come to a stop, and that will be the end of things, back to where it was before it all started. As in our myth, our own understanding of how this ends, things will become more disordered as we move closer and closer to the end, as that diffusion happens. This is our myth, and as we have seen, it has a lot in common with myths that we have looked at, and quite a few of them that we so far haven't. But if each culture has a myth of its own destruction, the myths are not identical either. Since each myth reflects values and beliefs of that culture, in an oversimplified way, we can divide them into two categories. The first category suggests that matter is eternal. So whatever happens to the cosmos, there will always be another one. There will be a rebirth similar to that happens at the end of flood stories. Both of those myths that we look at in this lecture will be of that sort. The other sort sees a real termination of the cosmos, a once and for all ending, so that when life goes on, if life goes on, it will be in an unearthly way and place. The Persian Zoroastrian Day of Judgment is of this sort, and so are the Christian and Islamic versions of the last day of the judgment. In Lecture 8, we remember discovering that in Zoroastrian cosmogony, on the last day, the cosmos will be entirely disassembled, taken apart, and recreated as individual human beings, every individual who ever lived, just as the cosmos was created in the first place by taking apart a divine body. What life could possibly be like after the cosmos has been destroyed, we can only imagine, since we have no experience of life outside this earth. Again, to use the Christian visionary expression in Revelations, chapter 21 says, "And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea." In that new life, whatever it's going to be, we are told God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. In this view, the cosmos, like each of us, has a limited lifespan, and it ends in death. What happens to each of us happens to it too, which is what Revelations is telling us in its own visionary way. The two myths that we're going to be looking at in this lecture have a slightly different story to tell, or in fact a very different story to tell, which is a story of renewal and rebirth after death, as in the flood stories, only this happens on a cosmic scale. The first one is from India, where we have already seen that their idea of that creation and destruction alternate with one another in an eternal cycle. Donna Rosenberg, in a book called World Mythology, says that we can think of the way the cosmos works as the way an individual does it. It passes from birth to maturity to death, except that it does so over and over and over. Each age moves from an ideal golden period to darker ones and darker ones and darker ones, and then comes back to a golden age and begins over again. Vishnu, in his three forms, as Brahma, as Vishnu, and as Shiva, directs this cycle. And it turns out that each age, as we move through one of these cycles, becomes morally more degenerate and of shorter duration than the previous one, until it sort of reaches entropy too. It runs out of gas, it runs out of energy, and has to be destroyed, and then has to begin all over again. As Rosenberg describes it, the first age is always a golden age in which humans need no shelters. Trees provide them with food and clothing, and they don't have to work for it. People are happy, and they spend their time in meditation and in observing dharma. Dharma is that Hindi word that means doing whatever duty is appropriate to your station in life. In the second age, virtue decreases and people devote themselves to knowledge. Knowledge, that is, becomes the highest virtue at this stage. But greedy people try to make those life-giving trees private property, and when they do so, those old, beautiful trees disappear, making life more difficult. The new trees need cultivation, and changes in weather mean that people now have to make shelters for themselves. Once this process gets started, humans become more passionate and greedy. Envy and resentment begin to rule. The stronger take lands and wives from the weaker. The next age, the balance between good and evil becomes very fragile, very precarious. Disease and misfortune and suffering become common. Sacrifice becomes the highest religious good. Religious doctrines and theology are developed to help people, but the slide into moral deterioration continues. The last age, which is the one that we live in now, is called the Kali Yuga. And in this age, people will get their high rank in society on the basis of wealth alone. Value will be determined entirely in terms of possessions. Sexual passion will be all that holds marriage together. People will succeed with lies and deceit, and the only pleasure in life will be sex. Hunger and disease and war and death will haunt people on every side. Only the poor and only a few of them will remain honest, and to escape the depredations of greedy kings, virtuous people will retreat to forests and remote valleys to live there as simply as they can. By the end of the Kali Yuga age, conditions are so bad that living to age 23 is a sign of great good fortune. The name for the age Kali Yuga is, the name Kali comes from the name of the great dark goddess of Hindu India, Kali, whose name, in fact, is the feminine form of a Sanskrit word for time, so that time as the devouring principle of creation is especially apparent in this last age. That's what the end of the world looks like to a Hindu Indian. I'm going to read you now a fairly extended passage from one of the Puranas about the last days of Kali, of the Kali Yuga age. And when I read this, I want you to think about some of the letters that you have seen in letters to the editor in the newspaper in the last while. And listen, I'm reading this because there's some really gripping details that are given in this account, which describes some of the things that will happen in these last days of the Kali Yuga. See how it sounds to you. All kings occupying the earth in the Kali age will be wanting in tranquility, strong in anger, taking pleasure at all times in lying and dishonesty, inflicting death on women, children, and cows, prone to take the paltry possessions of others, with a character that is mostly tamas. Tamas as a character means, this relates to darkness. The character is one of darkness. It relates to error or to ignorance. So what is said here, with a character that the rulers will have a character that is mostly tamas, rising to power and soon falling. They will be short-lived, ambitious, of little virtue, and greedy. People will follow the customs of others and be adulterated with them. Peculiar, undisciplined barbarians will be vigorously supported by the rulers. Because they go on living with perversion, they will be ruined. Now that's what rulership sounds like in this last Kali age. Talking in a more general way about the destruction of the world, we are told the destruction of the world will occur because of the departure from virtue and profit, little by little, day by day. Money alone will confer nobility. Power will be the sole definition of virtue. Pleasure will be the only reason for marriage. Lust will be the only reason for womanhood. Falsehood will win out in disputes. Being dry of water will be the only definition of land. That is, land will be considered useless for any other purpose. The only way you would define land down, if there's no water in it, then that's land. It's a real degradation from the early days. The sacred thread alone will distinguish the Brahmins. That is, wearing that little thread that identifies you as a Brahmin. That's all you need to be a real Brahmin in this last age, instead of having to live certain ways and have a certain character to go with it. Praiseworthiness will be measured by accumulated wealth. Wearing the linga will be sufficient cause for religious retreat. A linga is a symbol for Shiva, and simply having one of those, wearing the button, will mean you're a religious person. You don't have to do anything more than that. Finally, to finish off this last account of how bad things are going to be, impropriety will be considered good conduct, and only feebleness will be the reason for unemployment. Boldness and arrogance will become equivalent to scholarship. Only those without wealth will show honesty. Just a bath will amount to purification, and charity will be the only virtue. Abduction will be marriage. Simply to be well-dressed will signify propriety. Well, this list goes on for a long time, talking about how terrible this last age is going to be. But no matter how bad things get, and no matter how desperate this last age is, this, again, in Hindu Indian thought, is not the end of the cosmos. In Lecture 8, we remember understanding that the world will be destroyed by water, 100 years in the life of Brahma will pass, and then the sleeping Vishnu will awaken, and the whole cycle starts over when that great boar plunges down into the deep and brings up the sleeping earth to let it float, and the cycle begins again. And as we said in Hindu thought, individuals who haven't as yet achieved liberation will be then reborn into a new golden age. So that's what a myth of destruction, a picture of destruction looks like in Hindu Indian thought. The next one is one that comes from one of the best known ones in the world. This one comes from Norse mythology, and it describes the end of their world, which they called Ragnarok. The source for this is, again, Snorri Sturluson. We talked about him in Lecture 8. And at the very end of his Prose Edda, he recounts all of the things that are going to happen at the end of time as the cosmos winds down. We probably need to read the entire book of Snorri in order to understand the end, because so much of what happens at the end of this story has been set up by things that happened earlier. But in general, what will happen is at the end of time, monsters and giants who have been tied up or bound but not killed will escape, and they will precipitate a final battle between themselves on the one hand and the gods on the other, who will be assisted by those fallen warriors who have been taken off of battlefields by the Valkyries and taken to Valhalla to help in just this last fight. The monsters and the giants in this last fight will win, as these northern people always knew they would. The ending is foretold. There is no way that they can win this final battle. In Snorri, there are great signs of the end to come. And as in the book of Revelations telling us, how do we know it's getting close? Snorri gives us some things to watch for. These are the kind of things that will happen before the end begins. First of all, as he says, 3 harsh winters will follow each other without summers. Great wars will rage across the world, pitting father against son, brother against brother. Incest and adultery will become commonplace. The wolf that every night chases the moon across the sky and that chases the sun across the sky will catch and eat them, throwing the world into perpetual darkness. Once again, that sign, once the timekeepers begin to go awry, we can tell we're getting close to the end. Earthquakes will happen, and when the earthquakes come, mountains will fall down, trees will be uprooted, and all these upheavals will free the captive giants and monsters whom the gods have been able to bind but have not been able to destroy. Fenrir, the great wolf, who's been held captive for centuries, will be freed. The Midgard serpent, who lives underneath the waters, will thrash them into fury as he comes ashore, causing great tidal waves and floods. And then a ship of giants captained by Loki. Loki has been confined since the death of Balder. That great ship of giants will be loosed from its moorings, and it will sail to join the great battle. The skies will be torn apart, and Surt and the sons of Muspel, remember that's that southern region before the creation, they will come to join in the final battle, bringing their fire with them. And as they come, they will ride over Bifrost, the rainbow, toward Asgard, and the rainbow will break behind them. The forces at the end will meet on a great plain. Loki and the giants and all the forces of hell, the underworld, will join in the attack. The trumpeter of the gods will sound the alarm, and all the gods and the slain heroes will arm themselves for this last great battle. Odin, the chief of the gods, will be killed by Fenrir the wolf, who in turn will be killed by one of Odin's sons. Thor will kill the Midgard serpent, but will die a bit later from its poison. Surt, that fire demon, will kill Frey, and Loki and Heimdall, the watchmen of the gods, will kill each other, and so it will go across this horrible battlefield. At some point, Surt, that is this creature from Muspel with the fire and the flames, will fling fire over the entire earth and burn it up. As it burns, it will sink into the sea, and this epoch of cosmic history will end. But, and this is a very powerful but, because Norse mythology is fairly grim for the most part, but even in Norse mythology, this isn't the final end of the cosmos. After a time, and this is such a beautiful, sweet promise, the earth will rise up out of the sea, and when it rises, it will be green and fair again, and it will be covered with fields of corn that no one had to plant. 2 of Odin's sons will come to reoccupy what's left of Valhalla, and 2 sons of Thor will come to reclaim their father's hammer. They'll all meet, and when they sit around and talk about the battle that ended the world, they'll talk about it as a distant memory or a dream. Balder, the good god whose death at the hands of Loki precipitates this final catastrophe, will return from the dead to inaugurate a new and gentler and more generous age. Human beings will repopulate the earth when it is discovered, amazingly, miraculously, 2 of them, named Leif and Leifrasir, that is life and desire for life. The 2 of them have managed to survive, living on dew during the time that all of this was going on, and they will become the ancestors of a new human race. The sun, before she was eaten by the wolf, gave birth to a daughter, and that daughter will now take her mother's place in the sky. And once again, this marker of the passage of time, the sun will begin its daily path across the sky. And there will come a new creation, one that may very well be happier and gentler for human beings than the one that was destroyed. That's the way most cosmic destruction myths go. Either the cosmos is annihilated, but out of its annihilation, humans are recreated to live in some other place, or the earth is recreated into some kind of golden age, or at least a better one than the one that is just finished. It's as if, in our own Big Bang theory, we had the faith to believe that once we've reached entropy, the process could start all over again. And maybe the next time it would be better. Maybe everything would be closer to our heart's desire than this time was. What we learn from creation, flood, and destruction myths is first that life implies death. Whatever is created is differentiated. It's differentiated out of stasis, and it lives a life of desire, and it passes through growth towards death. Death is a child of time and is as much the result of creation as the division into yin and yang, into light and dark, into land and water, into earth and sky, into male and female. In creation, some grand primal unity is lost, which establishes the possibility for growth and development, but also establishes the need to return to that initial stasis, both for the individual and the cosmos itself. In many religions, Gnosticism and Buddhism and Hinduism and Persian Zoroastrianism, just for example, creation itself is seen as a kind of fall from primal perfection, an establishment of forms in matter that we need to be able to transcend in order to recapture our pre-creation unity and stability. Most of these religions teach that love or desire itself is death. And love and desire, of course, are not possible until we have been separated into fragments of some essential unity. Plato's Symposium and the Indian Upanishads both remind us that before we were fragmented into male and female, desire was neither necessary nor even possible. Perhaps most of our ideas of heaven or nirvana or the Elysian fields or whatever we think of as that perfect equilibrium we're heading back for, probably many of these ideas are based on our own preconscious memories of life in the womb, when for the only time in our existence we are absolutely at one with our environment. When there is no individuation, there is no separation, when all we had to do was to be, we were taken care of without having to work or even to wish for anything. The birth of every individual changes all that in a way that makes every single birth a recreation of creation. It's an entry into a world of separation and differentiation and individuation and all of the other resistances and frictions that go with them. Egyptian fathers used to raise their infant children with their hands over their heads, remembering that gesture of Shu separating the heaven and the earth and thereby making creation possible. Creation with all the wonderful possibilities that it makes possible, but inevitably also sending that child toward death, which is another inevitable consequence of creation. The moment that Atum stirs the waters, or Yahweh separates the heaven and the earth, or the cosmos is created out of the body of Tiamat or Panku, or Rangi and Papa are forced apart, or insect-like creatures emerge from underground into this world, or some lowly animal brings up a bit of mud from the primeval sea, or a cosmic egg appears on the surface of the deep, at any one of these moments, creation begins. And creation sets up for all of us everything that makes life interesting and beautiful and challenging and wonderful, but it also brings with it disease and pain and separation and death, both for us as individuals and for the cosmos. The alternative, which is always available, is the return to that primeval sea or chaos, where nothing happens, nothing is. Each of us and the cosmos itself, in coming into being, begins its movement back toward entropy and death, back to where we were before we started. And that is part of, I think, the great wisdom of all of these myths. Next time, we take off an entirely new direction. We will begin a unit on gods and goddesses. We'll begin by looking at some pantheons, and then we'll take a look at some stories of individual deities. In the process of that unit, we will try to do a kind of biography of the goddess as our perception of goddesses has changed over time. And we will also do a biography of God, looking at our perception of God or the gods has changed over time, and then try to interleave them. All of this begins with our next unit, the unit on gods and goddesses.